Welcome to today's 5-minute professional learning presented by CAPITALISE Education.
Hello, my name is Dr. Matt Cap from CAPITALISE Education. At CAPITALISE Education, we're regularly contacted by educators about the difference between the Universal Design for Learning and differentiated instruction frameworks. Whilst both of these frameworks are approaches to personalised learning for all students, they do have fundamental differences. In this video, we're going to explore 2 peer-reviewed journal articles which explore the differences between these 2 frameworks.
This quote from Thomson highlights the importance of examining the difference between universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. This is because definitions matter, and many of the key concepts of inclusive pedagogy are broad terms that require careful definition and distinction. Both the Universal Design for Learning framework and the differentiated instruction framework are both approaches to personalized learning for all students. Differentiated instruction has 4 key principles: focusing on essential skills and modifying the complexity of content to respond to the diverse needs of learners, responding to student diversity by using different strategies, integrating formative assessment into the planning, teaching, and assessment cycle, and implementing ongoing adjustments to content, process, and product. Akara talks about adjustments to curriculum, environment, and instruction. This cartoon floating around the internet shows a pictorial representation of the concept of differentiated instruction. The first image shows equality, that everyone gets the same. The second image shows the concept of equity or differentiated instruction. Students get what they need. The Universal Design for Learning framework is underpinned by 3 principles. Each of the columns in the diagram represents one of the principles that underpins the framework. The first column represents the idea that teachers engage students in the learning process in multiple ways. The second column represents the idea that teachers present information, knowledge, and understanding to students in multiple ways. And the third column represents the third principle, or the idea that students can demonstrate what they can do in multiple ways. Each of these 3 principles is underpinned by 3 fundamental ideas. The first is to build students' access to the curriculum. The second idea is that teachers need to build on the students' abilities. And the third underpinning idea is that students need to be supported to internalize the skills that they have developed. This image floating around the internet shows the difference between differentiated instruction and universal design for learning. The first picture represents the concept of equality, everyone gets the same. The second picture highlights the concept of equity, every student gets what they need, which is the concept of differentiated instruction. The third image represents the concept of universal design for learning, because in this instance, teachers have identified what are the barriers that exist to participation and learning. And in this image, the fence. So the fence has been removed to remove the barriers to accessing the game so that all of the 3 people in the image can see the game. So when we look at the literature, the relationship between universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are represented in 3 different ways. The first model is that universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are 2 independent models that have nothing to do with each other. I disagree with this approach because teaching is not a black and white approach. It's a fluid, dynamic, interrelated process of many different frameworks and many different approaches. So the concept of universal design for learning and differentiated instruction being 2 separate independent models, I personally don't agree with. The second relationship that's discussed in the literature between universal design for learning and differentiated instruction takes a very different approach to the first one. In this one, It sees universal design for learning as being the overarching approach to personalized learning. Within this approach to personalized learning, differentiated instruction is a small embedded part of the universal design for learning framework. I also don't agree with this approach because I think that universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are separate but related. Differentiated instruction isn't just part of the universal design for learning framework. The third way that the literature looks at the relationship between universal design for learning and differentiated instruction is as complementary theories. And this is the approach that I ascribe to. Both universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are both approaches to personalized learning that are interrelated. Universal design for learning is that idea that at the very beginning, during the planning process, teachers think about all the strengths and challenges of their student and what are the barriers that exist in the learning process, and use the universal design for learning framework to help overcome these as much as possible during the planning, teaching, and assessing cycle. However, for some students, they may need more than universal design for learning. So this is where the differentiated instruction approach comes in, where teachers will then make adjustments to what they are doing for all students to help all students access learning on the same basis. For this reason, I believe that both universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are two complementary theories. A good way of looking at the relationship between universal design for learning and differentiated instruction is to represent it within the response to intervention model. In Tier 1, that all students receive is universal design for learning. That idea that during the planning process, I think about all the strengths and challenges of my students and the barriers that might exist to the learning process, and I use the UDL framework to help overcome these. In the Tier 2 model, I continue to use universal design for learning, but for some students, I start bringing in the differentiated instruction framework. As we move into the Tier 3 model, for a very small number of students, differentiated instruction becomes the focus for these students whilst they continue to receive universal design for learning. So as we move through the three tiers of the response to intervention model, the relationship and the focus of the two frameworks changes.
Thank you for watching this video exploring the conditions that need to exist within schools and classrooms to implement the Universal Design for Learning framework.
Thank you for listening to today's 5-minute professional learning bite presented by CAPITALISE Education. At CAPITALISE Education, we believe that educators achieve a lot more when they work collaboratively than when they work independently. As the African proverb goes, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.